Who is Zelensky? President Volodymyr Zelensky has become the face of Ukraine's resistance against Russian President Vladimir Putin's invading forces, with impassioned speeches such as an address to the United Nations Security Council in which he accused Russian forces of committing war crimes. Mr. Zelensky came into power with little traditional political experience. Before he was elected, he was best known for playing a television role as an ordinary schoolteacher accidentally catapulted into power. The show, Servant of the People, ran for 4 years, making him a household name. Since the Russian strikes began on February 24, Mr. Zelensky has captured the world's imagination. Often dressing in military T-shirts or ballistic vests as he urges people to press the fight during videos he posts to Telegram, Facebook and Instagram from the center of Kyiv. On April 18, he posted another video address where he warned that Russian forces had begun a fresh offensive in eastern Ukraine. At other times, the 44-year-old has harangued Western leaders to step up efforts to defeat Mr. Putin. Frustrated with the West's unwillingness to intervene militarily, Mr. Zelensky has repeatedly pressed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. An idea NATO has rejected, saying it would put the alliance into a war with Russia. He has repeatedly called on Western nations to provide Ukraine with artillery, ammunition, air defense systems and jet fighters to repel Russian forces, or he warned, Poland, Romania, Moldova and the Baltic states could be next. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was intended only as a beginning, then they want to capture other countries, he said in a late-night address on April 23. Mr. Zelensky has met with a number of world leaders who traveled to Kyiv after Russian forces pivoted to consolidate their positions toward the east of the country. Those arriving included U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the presidents of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi led a delegation of U.S. lawmakers to Kyiv to meet with Mr. Zelensky and offer Ukraine their support, while the Ukrainian leader used the visit to push for more international support for his country's military effort. Mr. Zelensky's exact location is a security matter. In an ABC interview, he said he had been offered safe passage out of the country if the situation further deteriorated, but he said he would remain. He makes occasional forays out of the capital, sometimes to dramatic effect. Mr. Zelensky on April 4 visited the town of Bucha near Kyiv, where he said there was evidence that more than 300 civilians had been killed or tortured in the area, and that more atrocities could be uncovered as Russian forces retreated to eastern Ukraine. The following day he spoke by video to the UN Security Council in New York, where he catalogued an avalanche of alleged abuses. There is not a single crime that they would not commit there, Mr. Zelensky said to the Security Council. Some of them were shot on the streets, others were thrown into wells, so they died there in suffering. Civilians were crushed by tanks while sitting in their cars in the middle of the road, Mr. Zelensky said. Women were raped and killed in front of their children. Russia has denied the allegations, saying photographs and videos showing dead civilians had been fabricated. Mr. Zelensky was elected president in 2019, defeating the incumbent Petro Poroshenko by casting himself as an anti-establishment outsider bent on rooting out corruption and securing better relations with Moscow. His pitch was largely based on the role he played on his TV show, where he portrayed an ordinary man thrown into the presidency to clean up the country. His political party was even named after the show. Mr. Zelensky is at the apex of a sophisticated public relations effort to build global backing for Ukraine. From hand-shot videos from the streets of Kyiv to his addresses to the United Nations and the U.S. Congress, Mr. Zelensky is careful to tailor his message for his specific audience. He invoked the attacks of 9/11 and Pearl Harbor for American lawmakers and referred to Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany as he spoke by video link to the British Parliament. When speaking to the Irish Parliament, he referred to the danger of famine in other parts of the world because of the disruption to Ukraine's huge agricultural exports. He told the Grammy Awards that Ukraine's cities were being silenced by the Russian war machine, and during an interview for the Wall Street Journal's CEO Council Summit in London he said global companies had a critical role to play in isolating Russia and reviving Ukraine's economy. In Ukraine, his customary late-night addresses over social media have become a rally point for ordinary Ukrainians. Sat at his desk, Mr. Zelensky provides updates on how the conflict is progressing, applauding the sacrifices of the Ukrainian armed forces and warning of the tests to come. Early on, Mr. Zelensky directed much of his energy toward projecting a sense of calm as Russian forces steadily built up along Ukraine's borders to eventually total as many as 190,000 troops. He said U.S. warnings of an imminent invasion were overblown and were damaging Ukraine's economy. Mr. Zelensky pointed to an even larger Russian buildup last spring that was eventually withdrawn. But after the first Russian strikes began to hit Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities on February 24, he pivoted hard toward shoring up Ukraine's defense, securing as much Western assistance as he could obtain. With Russian propaganda claiming he had already fled the country, he made a hand-shot video of himself out on the street in front of the presidential palace in Kyiv to urge on Ukrainians in their defense of the country. It drew millions of views on Telegram and Facebook. Gone were the suits and ties, in came military sweatshirts. Mr. Zelensky spoke frequently with Western leaders, urging them to increase sanctions on Moscow in the hope of breaking the Russian advance. As he pleaded with European leaders in a video call to take tougher action, he warned them that this might be the last time they saw him alive, according to several diplomats. The silence in the room was impressive, a senior European Union official said. Shortly after, the 27-nation bloc moved to significantly expand the range of measures as the West hardened its response to Moscow's aggression. Mr. Zelensky has since been on a virtual tour of capitals to rally support for Ukraine. In addition to the UN and the US Congress, he has addressed people in the UK, Germany and Switzerland, among others, with plans for further outreach to seek assistance and keep international pressure on Russia. So far he hasn't succeeded in persuading the West to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. He is also pushing Western nations to do more to tighten sanctions, including an embargo on oil sales to the EU. On April 21, he suggested to a meeting of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund that a new global tax be imposed on any transactions with Russia to help pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine, which has seen more than 1,000 schools and universities destroyed or damaged in addition to other infrastructure losses. Mr. Zelensky said Ukraine needs $7 billion every month until the summer to keep functioning. World Bank President David Malpass said the Russian operation has caused at least $60 billion in damage to Ukraine's infrastructure. Mr. Zelensky initially sought a rapprochement with Russia when he was elected president in 2019. Ukraine had been at loggerheads with the Kremlin since 2014, when Russian forces annexed the Black Sea port of Crimea and stirred up a rebellion that led to two pro-Russian regions breaking away from Kyiv's control. Mr. Zelensky pledged to improve relations with Mr. Putin, and had some early successes. He secured a prisoner exchange with Russia and moved toward a deal on how to build on a 2015 ceasefire agreement. Street protests against his plans forced him to change tack. Western diplomats warned him that Mr. Putin was trying to get him to sign an agreement that would provide Mr. Putin with long-term influence over Ukraine's future via Russia's proxies in the breakaway regions, with the goal of barring the country from joining the EU or NATO. Mr. Zelensky instead turned toward persuading NATO to engage in a closer relationship with Ukraine while launching a popular campaign to win back control of the strategic Crimean Peninsula. A person close to him said Russia had begun to see him as being too similar to Mr. Poroshenko, whom he succeeded as president, and as someone intent on pushing Ukraine closer to the West. Political analysts said the prospect of Ukraine aligning itself more closely with the West had enraged Mr. Putin, who has long been trying to restore Russia's sphere of influence, which had been curtailed severely since the end of the Cold War more than 30 years earlier. Like, comment, share and subscribe to my channel.